his adult career, or I should say apostolate, in Rome, and he was an absolutely marvelous saint. He was extremely zany. He played tons of practical jokes, mostly on himself, and would also have some of his disciples do sort of zany things. He was all about mortifying your vanity, and he did this through humor.
Okay. Do you know any of the pranks or stuff that he did that stick out?
He would sometimes shave half his beard off and walk through the public streets. He would wear extremely dorky, mismatched clothes. He had to teach his disciples humility. He had one of them carry a giant dog through the streets of Rome. Rather than walk the dog, he had to just carry the dog. Things like that, just totally bizarre things.
In your drink, the Boulevardier.
Oh, yeah.
Does that by chance have Boulevard included within it, Kansas City's own drink, or is that something else?
The Boulevardier is a different kind of drink. It's an old drink, and I assigned it to St. Philip Neri because he was the classical Boulevardier. A Boulevardier is someone who walks up and down the boulevard, and that's exactly what he did. He just walked up and down the streets of Rome and won people's hearts over to him. He was a great apostolate of the common man.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Another person, too, that you mentioned earlier, St. Nicholas, I know that he is the patron saint of maidens and sailors. And the reason I know that is because the book Miss Rumphius by Barbara Cooney is dedicated to him. That's a children's book that, to my kids, I've probably read about 2,000 or 3,000 times. Huh. So I might as well know this fact. How did he become the patron saint of these particular things? As you mentioned, he's the inspiration for Santa Claus. And what is your drink associated with him?
I've got a couple of drinks. On the Feast of St. Nicholas, there is a traditional drink called Bishop's Wine from the Netherlands. It's sort of a hot wine punch, and it's very good. My friend Peter Kwasniewski also has a delightful drink called the Incensed Bishop, which has to do with a legend about his behavior at the Council of Nicaea. He got so upset with the heretic Arius, according to this legend, that he slapped him. It's probably not true, but it's still a great story. But he is the patron saint of more causes than any other saint except the Blessed Virgin Mary. Huh. It's insane the number of patronages that he has. A lot of this because of Eastern Orthodox devotion. So some of these aren't necessarily practiced in the West, but they still are authentic patronages. Literally hundreds. They're not all listed in the book. There are just too many of them.
Do you know why that is? Why has he taken such a foothold? Is it because of his role in the early church and then it has this multiplier effects? Or is there something about his story that connects with people that made him this omnipresent patron?
It's both. I think he was one of the very first prominent saints who was clearly a patron saint of the little guy. When you think of the saints of the early church, the first thing we see are the martyrs. And they give this incredible testimony and witness to Christ. But you don't think of them sort of as supporters of the little guy. You think of them primarily as people whose blood was shed for our Lord. So the martyrs are in this kind of special category. And then following the martyrs are what we call the confessors, holy men and women who did not die a martyr's death, but we recognize as saints. And most of the first confessors were these great minds, great theologians, the fathers of the church, Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, Pope Gregory the Great, and so on. These are mighty men, and they certainly were great pastors of souls, but they were also these sort of brilliant intellectuals. Nicholas was the first saintly bishop, it seems to me, who wasn't necessarily a great intellectual. He was just kind of, in a sense, you could think of him as just sort of a blue-collar kind of bishop. He wasn't blue-collar himself, he came from a wealthy family, but he very much was just a sort of supporter of the common man. I think that really connected with people, and they sort of multiplied patronages as a result of that.
If I remember our last discussion, there was his skull that's a holy relic that was examined, and I think they saw he had a broken nose.
Exactly. So that's one of the things that gives credence to the legend that he slapped Arius at the Council of Nicaea, like, oh, well, he was a pugilist. He was used to settling things this way. The problem, though, is that the broken nose could have come from torture. He had been imprisoned during the Roman persecutions. He lived to see those days end, but it was very easy to imagine his nose getting broken in prison. Or it could have actually been broken posthumously when these Italian merchants absconded the relics of St. Nicholas from his original place in Turkey and brought them to Bari, Italy. They did a very hasty job of it because they were basically raiding the tomb. They were stealing the relics. And so they broke a lot of bones in the process. So they could have broken his nose.
If it is true that he did get it broken fighting Arius, and he is a patron saint of the common man, I'd like to think he's similar to Nacho Libre, the monk who fought as a luchador to save an orphanage. I might be off there, but I like to imagine that.
I could see that work.
Well, I want to take a little segue before I come back to some of these saints, but I'm guessing that the sources of a lot of these stories come from hagiographies, which are legends of saints. And I've seen hagiographies in a couple of places. Actually, one of my professors who looked at the Ottoman Empire in the 1500s and 1700s was looking at hagiographies of Eastern Orthodox clergymen, most of whom were martyred for, in this case, not converting to Islam, but it could have been other things. And she used it as a historical source, and as a historian, she would discount supernatural elements, but think, the reason that he was being martyred, the things that he was doing that seemed to have resonance with the community, whether it's protecting women from being married to the Turks or stopping exploitation of authorities, can tell us about what was important at that time. Maybe authorities were corrupt and it took a holy man to lay down his life. Maybe there was worry in the community of Christian women marrying Muslim men, so he was laying down his life for that as well. Can you just describe hagiographies a little bit? Because my audience is very interested in these types of sources and how our historical understanding comes down. First as a religious source, but then also how historians use hagiographies to understand the past.
Yeah, it is a complicated issue, but what you were saying reminds me of a saying before Vatican II, when during the office of Matins, during the second nocturne, the life of a saint would be read. And there was an old French saying about somebody who engaged in pious dissimulation. He lies like a second nocturne. And that was a reference to the kind of exaggerated stories that often have to do with the lives of the saints. And you're right, your teacher is right. You can always sort of glean, okay, there are kernels of truth in this exaggerated tale. The exaggerated tale is often the result of kind of a game of telephone. As it gets passed from one generation to the next, it gets embellished. The problem, though, of taking too historical approach with these stories is that you basically try to unscramble an omelet. And it's really hard to separate the fact from the fiction. Mm-hmm. So I agree, we have to recognize these legends are legends. On the other hand, I don't think we'll ever be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so my attitude is simply not accept the legend as absolutely true, but cherish the legend. These are family stories that have been passed down in our somewhat quirky, dorky, and not always literate family. But you cherish them nonetheless. And you're not sure what part is true and what part isn't. But you recognize that there is value to the tale. And so you keep it and you pass it on.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, too. There's an ecumenical aspect of saints' legends where in every branch of Christendom you can find them. There's Catholic ones we've mentioned. There's Orthodox ones. in the ancient world and also the Ottoman world and the modern era Protestants, things like Fox's Book of Martyrs. You'll see these sprinkled around different areas.
Yeah, talk about legends.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's all over the place.
A lot of exaggerations in that one.
Actually, I've never heard a historical take on Fox's Book of Martyrs. Just as a very quick seg for readers, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course. So that was written prior or during the Reformation? No, it was after the Reformation in England of Catholics who had persecuted Protestants within England, and Fox's book was a collection of this. So let me know if I'm missing anything, and then also historically, what are issues with that work? I'm curious.
Well, you're right about the profile, and I don't know a great deal about it, except that it's figures about the number of Protestants killed under the reign of Queen Mary was outrageously exaggerated. The whole thing is made to vilify Catholics. And obviously there are some valid criticisms to be made of the way Queen Mary tried to reinstitute Catholicism after the death of her father, Henry VIII. But, Fox's stuff is it's propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the age of tracts, I think this was when people would print pamphlets and stuff like that. It's an early kind of flame war era where if you want to rile people up, great time to do that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, let's return to some of your other profiles. When you mentioned St. Jude, you link him specifically to finding a parking spot when you're running late. So what's his story? Why is he a patron saint of this? And then what's a drink associated with him?
Well, I associate him with, this is my own suggestion. He's not been officially given this designation, but I think he's a great saint to pray to when you are really, really in need of finding a parking space and you're running late, because he's the patron saint of desperate causes. And that's when I feel very desperate, is when I'm looking for a parking spot.
Right. And how's the Desperado made?
Yes, so there are a couple of drinks in his honor, and one of them is the Desperado, and it is indeed an interesting drink. There are actually two of them. The one I'm thinking of, though, is made with Cynar, which is, I believe, an Italian artichoke liqueur, and it is crazy bitter. The recipe only calls for 1/4 of an ounce of Cynar, but it's still kind of a punch in the face when you have this cocktail. Maybe I'm not selling it very well right now, but it actually is really good. The first sip just hits you hard, but then by the time you get to the bottom of the glass, you sort of sense the complexity of the drink. It's got a very interesting sort of flavor profile. So I do recommend it. It is an interesting drink.
There's another person too, Catherine of Alexandria, and I get my Catherines mixed up. I know Catherine of Siena, she's in the 1300s. That's not the case for Catherine of Alexandria. So when did she live? What's her story? And how does she connect to headaches?
She is supposed to be an early church martyr. I say supposed to be because she's one of those saints that historians will say, well, we don't really have proof that she ever actually existed. The earliest biographies of her from the 7th century. We don't have any testimony from the 4th century or 3rd century. But there is a really strong tradition of praying to St. Catherine of Alexandria in both the East and the West. And St. Joan of Arc says she saw her. When St. Joan of Arc had her visions, she saw Michael the Archangel, Catherine of Alexandria, Margaret of Antioch, and she swore upon the thread of her life that these are the saints that she saw. So this is, again, one of those things where you're forced to choose between what the historical experts say and what other saints are saying. But the reason why she's the patron saint of headaches is that she was beheaded.
That will solve it real quickly.
Yeah.
What's the drink associated with that?
Let's see. I think I have a lot of recommendations for Catherine of Alexandria. You'll have to forgive me, Scott. In the course of researching this book, some brain cells were destroyed in the process.
You have trillions of backups, so it's fine.
Oh, good. I don't remember what I assigned Catherine
That's
of
fine.
Alexandria.
Hey, it's all the more reason for people to check it out. So
Absolutely. I'll beguile them.
And then there are others that you associate with things that are not part of the medieval tradition of patron saints, such as saints for credit cards and parking spaces, or we already discussed parking spaces, but credit cards and Uber drivers and social media. So Who are some of those people, and how did you associate them with these different things?
I'm very excited and proud of myself for figuring out who the patron saint of credit cards should be.